You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is the mystery of the lost boy Melvin Horst. Now, this is a case that ate away at investigators so much that they never officially closed it, and yet it is still unsolved today, and there's just a trail of deception throughout the entire thing. By the way, this is a collab with the wonderful Gabulosis, or Gabby, and she is someone who also does a ton of vintage cases on YouTube, and she is one of the only ones I've found that do that as well as I do. So I figured this would be the perfect opportunity to do a collab to introduce her to you guys. She is someone who shows an incredible amount of empathy for all of her victims, and of course that is always something that I look for in true crime YouTubers, and I know you guys will absolutely love her, so make sure to go over there after you watch this video and watch her video that I will be in as well, but she will be making an appearance later on in this video to tell you parts of Melvin's case. But now, if you haven't already subscribed, I would love for you to subscribe to this channel. I really truly want to tell the victim stories. It's a passion of mine, and to have you support me would mean the world. Now let's get back to this story. So it was 1928 in Ohio, and the Horst family lived between Vine Street and Paradise Street in Orrville, Ohio. Now, Raymond and Zora Horst had two children at the time, an 8-year-old named Ralph and a 4-year-old named Melvin. They did okay. They weren't rich, but they weren't necessarily the poorest of the poor. They were just kind of a middle-class family that was doing okay. Around this time, it was Christmas, and there were lots of Christmas trees, Christmas decorations, there were presents everywhere. It was just a happy, joyful, cold time. But just 2 days after Christmas, on December 27th of 1928, everything would change, not only for the Horst family, but for the entire town of Orrville. And when I say that, I don't mean it lightly. This is a case that changed so many people's lives in so many different ways, and you'll really see that there is a difference in the community back then than there is today. And it's beautiful that this happened like this back then, but it's kind of sad to know that this isn't how it is today. You see, that afternoon of December 27th, 4-year-old Melvin went outside, bundled up in a coat and a hat, and he was going to go play. And now he had just gotten a little red toy wagon or truck that he wanted to play with outside, and so he did so, and his mother was watching out the window as she prepared dinner. Now, she, of course, got sidetracked by what she was doing in the kitchen, wasn't watching him 24/7, and by the time 4:30 came around and she was finished with dinner, she called out to him, and he did not come for dinner. She eventually sent her 8-year-old son, Ralph, to the neighbors to see if he had gone over there to play indoors since it was cold outside, to play with some friends perhaps. And Ralph came back saying he wasn't anywhere. However, his red toy wagon was still in their front yard. Melvin's father, Raymond, came home from work, and Zora was still looking around for him, not being able to find him. Dinner was ready. They were all kind of panicking, and Raymond decided to go help Zora search the entire neighborhood, and they did this for probably an hour before eventually deciding, look, we just need to call the police. Thankfully, their uncle, well, Melvin's uncle, and their brother was the marshal of the town, and so he was of course right on top of it, knowing that Melvin was his nephew, and got to looking for him. One of the first witnesses was a little boy named Bobby Evans, who said that Melvin had gone down the street in this vacant lot and was playing with some of the other boys as well as Bobby, and it was down by the railroad tracks. They were all just playing together, and there were 3 other boys with them. However, when it started to get dark, Bobby was told by Melvin in his sweet little 4-year-old voice, "Goodbye, Bobby, I got to go home now." And he turned and he started walking towards home, and that was the last time Bobby saw him. Bobby thought he made it home. Now, Amber Alerts at this time were not really a thing. I mean, of course, they couldn't just send a text to your phone saying someone's missing, look out for them. But Orrville had a different type of system when something like this would happen. You see, they would sound the fire alarm, and this would go out to everyone in the neighborhoods knowing that something was wrong, and it made it a fast and efficient way to get out the news.
When the fire alarm turned on to alert the residents, hundreds of people rushed out to see what was wrong. About 400 people started going door to door through his neighborhood, and they ended up covering about 100 square miles. The local radio broadcasted a description of Melvin, and that night, temperatures were down in the 30s, and people were not giving up when it came to looking for this little boy. They searched everywhere, from wells to ice-covered ponds. The next day, Melvin was still missing, and his family believed that he had been kidnapped, but police couldn't pinpoint a motive as to why he would have been kidnapped. The horse didn't have a ton of money, and they didn't have any known enemies. Unless he was abducted by somebody who thought he was the son of their wealthy neighbor who was a manufacturer, except there were no ransom demands ever made. Police then searched what would now be called registered sex offenders. They looked in their houses, and all of them pretty much had alibis, so all of them checked out completely, and it was said that none of them seemed to have anything to do with this case.
Now, this case quickly became huge news, spreading all the way to London, having this case covered. And of course, this meant that many tips were coming in saying they had spotted Melvin different places. I mean, one said that he was at an Akron gas station, another was with an elderly couple in a Columbus streetcar, and another was on a Mansfield train. However, none of these panned out to actually be Melvin. Melvin's mother, Zora, said that she had always told him to beware of strangers, to never get in the car with them, and that he was just a very aware little boy. Even though he was 4 years old, he wasn't going to do anything, or she didn't think he was going to go with any strangers willingly. However, no one had heard screams or anything of the sorts. And although his family did believe it was an abduction, the police necessarily weren't on the same page, because back then it was almost like they believed motive had to be there for a kidnapping. You know, it couldn't just be a bad person that wanted to kidnap him for no reason. They felt that it had to be a connection to this boy. And I'm not sure this is in every case back then, but it really did seem like in this case they felt like nobody would have just kidnapped him randomly. He had to have a reason for that. The family had to be involved in some way. And that wasn't necessarily true, and they weren't finding anything in this case just yet. However, they were about to. Because you see, I told you that Melvin's uncle was a city marshal. His name was Roy Horst. And he was very well known in the community for being a large enforcer of the laws, and especially one that was from the Prohibition era that banned the distribution and the production of alcohol. And so there are many people who didn't abide by this law who were named bootleggers, who would sell and make this alcohol to different people, and this was their business. And Roy was very, very strong in enforcing the laws and getting these bootleggers locked away, and many of them hated him for that. He had many enemies, and Roy had actually lived with Melvin's immediate family in their home just previous to Melvin's abduction or Melvin's disappearance. And so they were afraid that possibly one of these bootleggers saw him at this home and believed that Melvin was his son, or maybe just even thought he was his nephew, and decided to take Melvin as a revenge plot on him for either getting someone in their family in jail or just wanting to get bootleggers in general locked up. And this is when investigators got their first real witness on what could have possibly happened to Melvin after he started walking home that day. This was from an 8-year-old named Charles Jr. Hanna. Now, he went by Junior, and he went to police saying that that day he was one of the boys playing with Bobby and Melvin. And this is when 17-year-old Arthur Arnold, who was a son of a bootlegger named Elias Arnold, came up to him and said, or basically asked him if he could send Melvin to their house after they were done playing. And when they were all leaving, Melvin appeared to be going in the direction of the Arnold household. Now, Junior said that he saw that the Arnolds were kind of in an alleyway, and Melvin walked up to them. He was offered an orange, and he accepted it, and then Arthur and Elias decided to carry him inside their home. He kind of dropped the orange as they did. It wasn't like an aggressive kind of rushing into the home, but they just kind of picked him up, carried him inside, and a little while later they carried him back out and put him into a green car. Now, they drove away at this point. However, another witness came forward that kind of corroborated this story without even knowing, saying that there had been a green car that day in Orville that drove past them and asked them for directions. They wanted directions to Mansfield, and they said that a man was driving, a woman was in the back seat, but this woman was consoling a little child. Now, Roy had arrested a number of members of the Arnold family for different bootlegging crimes, and Melvin would often tell people that if they were doing anything bad, that he was going to tell his Uncle Roy on them. And so it was just kind of, he was a little boy, but it was just a threat that people heard, even if they weren't scared by it. And this could have been how the Arnolds heard that he was related to him. But on January 2nd of 1929, the first arrest in this case would be made of Arthur and Elias, as well as Elias's other children, William and Dorothy, and Dorothy's husband, Bascom McHenry. Now, they were all charged with child stealing, and Roy even said that, yeah, he had it out for Roy, but he didn't have anything to do with Melvin's disappearance. However, prosecutors argued that Elias and Arnold definitely knew that Melvin had a relation to Roy, and they kidnapped him for revenge. So that March, the two of them went to trial because they were the ones in the witness statement that were spoken of and not the entire family. However, it was believed that Dorothy could have been in the back seat consoling Melvin if this was really the whole family's doing. However, in trial, the Arnold's attorney brought forward a witness named Ora Watts, who had said that he had searched the property of the Arnolds before the police did, and because he had heard the story of when Junior was telling his statement, he had heard that he had dropped an orange, that Melvin had been said to drop this orange, so he went to look. Now, I couldn't find who Ora Watts really was, but it was said that he went and searched the property. He didn't see an orange anywhere. However, 2 days later, the investigators would go and search and find an orange. And they were bringing this up because they thought that maybe the investigators had planted that evidence to make Junior's statement more realistic. But Elias even said, if I wanted to get even with Marshall Horst, I'd take it out of his skin. Now, the jury deliberated for 7 hours before finding Elias and Arnold both guilty. Elias got 20 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary, whereas Arthur, who was only 17, went to the Mansfield Reformatory.
The search for Melvin was still on, and it was so talked about that it was kind of giving everybody a bit of paranoia. For instance, there was a woman driving through Seville one time, and she saw a little boy playing in a yard, and she pulled up to the curb. Apparently, this little boy playing in his yard looked exactly like Melvin Horst. She pulled up and said, "It's the missing Orville boy, and I'm going to take him right to his mother." And she would have if it wasn't for his aunt and uncle, who came out and proved that this wasn't Melvin Horst. This type of paranoia was probably brought on by all of the false stories going around at the time. For instance, at one point there were bones found at the Arnold residence, and they didn't know yet if they were human bones or animal bones, and it was released to the public that they were in fact human bones before they were even tested or before they could find out what they were. And in the end, it was found out that they were not human bones. There was also a rumor that a hatchet had been found with blood and blonde hair on it. This was also false as well.
Now, there was also a rumor about Arnold's daughter, Dorothy, that during questioning she had said, "My husband and I are innocent, but those boys are in for it." And she was supposedly talking about Arthur and Elias and possibly her brother William as well. We're not really sure, but when they were walking her back to her cell, she passed her father's cell, and she kind of allegedly whispered to him, "They wanted to tell me." And he said, "Tell hell, tell nothing." But this was super confusing because 8 months later, they would be acquitted in a second trial, and so it just made this story make no sense if Dorothy was telling her father, you know, you're going to go to prison, and I didn't tell them anything, and her father was saying, don't tell them anything. It just doesn't make sense. So I'm not really sure how realistic this can be, but all of the statements in this case are that confusing, which is what makes it so aggravating, because they don't make sense and they just get crazier from here. The investigators had found that Junior, this person who allegedly witnessed all of this, could not have seen all he saw at the place he said he was standing, and so their trial that December claimed that Junior had changed his story many times and was possibly lying. Junior asked why he waited 4 days to tell anybody what he had seen, and he said, "Because nobody asked me." And a few days after the Arnolds were released, the Horst family actually got an anonymous letter saying that if they didn't call the police, if there were no tricks, they would return Melvin for $100. And of course, the Horst family, back then, 100, I mean, it was a pretty hefty amount, but it was something that they could handle. It wasn't anything like $1 million. And so, of course, they had that 100 bill ready, and they waited for Melvin or any sort of sign of him. But unfortunately, nobody ever came and nobody ever collected that $100. Now they had 0 suspects once again, and they still had no idea where Melvin was. And they were kind of at the point of, what do we do, when the Junior Hannah, the 8-year-old witness, came forward again. This time, Junior said that he had taken Melvin to a garage in Orville where Earl Connaught killed him. Now, Earl was brought into custody and immediately said that he wasn't the one who killed Melvin. It was his friend, Charles Hannah, who was Junior Hannah's father. And Charles Hannah was also a local bootlegger in the area. They questioned Charles for 36 hours without letting him fall asleep, and eventually he said, "Okay, fine. I wanted to get back at Roy for ruining my bootlegging business, so I took his nephew and I hit him over the head with a 4x4, stuffed him in a sack, and buried him in my backyard." Except for this is something the police could easily find if it was true or not, and they immediately went to the Hannah residence and dug up his entire backyard, only to find that there was no body. And so they went back to Charles and they said, "Okay, you were lying. What's the actual truth?"
Finding nothing, that's when Charles changed his story yet again. This time he said there were 2 Italians from Akron who wanted Melvin dead or alive. So Charles hit him over the head and put him in their car. Apparently one of these men was a bootlegger named Tony LaFatch, and he paid Charles in 25 gallons of liquor. Charles said he didn't know if the boy was dead or alive. He didn't mean to kill him, but he was simply too drunk to notice. He then made his son make up a story about the Arnold family because a personal vendetta. The Hannahs and the Arnolds were rival bootleggers as well as family members. But days later, Charles withdrew his confession, saying he only signed it to stop the interrogation. Charles and Earl were then released, but no one was ceasing efforts to find Melvin. And it became so emotionally and mentally exhausting for everyone in the town that there were reporters passing out in the streets, and the mayor even suffered a nervous breakdown.
And in 1940, 12 years later, the governor ordered for the investigation to be looked into again. It didn't need to be reopened because it was already open. It was never really closed, but they wanted to put even more effort into looking into it once again. This didn't come up with any more clues. However, they still did believe that Melvin could be alive. And in 1943, Roy theorized the hijackers caused more of a sensation than they intended and feared to return the lad because they wouldn't kill him and get themselves in any deeper. He probably passed from one bootlegger to another until they lost all idea where he came from, and now he's probably in the army. And this is why the same year Melvin's parents actually moved and began to work at B.F. Goodrich Company that provided equipment for the war, because they believed that this is a way that they could help their son even if they didn't necessarily know where he was. If they believed he was in the army, helping him with equipment would be their way to contribute. And their other son Ralph was also in the army as well. Before they moved, however, when Melvin first went missing, the Christmas tree was still up, and so for 3 years the Christmas tree was replaced as often as it would dry up, and his Christmas presents were still laid out where he had been playing with them, and for 3 years they did not move anything. Throughout the years, Melvin's father searched every single tip and clue that would come in on his own. I mean, he would get some help occasionally, but he would take it into his own hands to search for the most part. His parents eventually moved to Florida, and Raymond died in 1961 at 60, and Zora in 1986 at 87. But authorities say they have never officially closed this case, and he would be 95 today. Now, at the time of his disappearance, Melvin was 3'1", 49 pounds, Caucasian with light brown hair and blue eyes. He was wearing a checked sweater, a brown overcoat, and a stocking cap. Melvin also had a jagged burn scar on his thigh and a slightly upturned nose and a stocky build. And if you have any information, please contact the Oroville Police Department at 330-684-5025. But what do you think happened to him? I truly believe the Hannahs had something to do with it. And that's because how would you make a 8-year-old boy lie so much if you didn't have something to do with it? And this could be his father and the bootleggers, or it could be Junior himself. I'm not sure if this theory was ever looked into, but for some little boy to be able to lie so easily and keep things straight and go from one story to another and not crack under all that pressure, and could this mean he could have killed Melvin? He was double his age and could possibly have done it. I'm just not sure that at that time they were ready to admit that a kid could have killed another kid. Then did his father possibly help him dump the body? Or was it Hannah's and bootleggers, and they did really just pass him around so often because they didn't necessarily want to kill him, but they also didn't know what to do with him because it was such big media attention. Maybe they only did it to scare Roy, and then they got way too over their heads and didn't feel like they could give the boy back without getting caught. Because I think if they were really trying to hurt Roy, wouldn't a body being found hurt him even more than a missing child? Although, I mean, that can be taken both ways, because not knowing whatever happened is also just as heartbreaking. So I don't know, but I just feel like they possibly were just trying to mess with him and maybe got a little too over their heads. I mean, could it have been like the Marjorie West case that I just covered, where one of the theories was that they were abducted by someone who had just lost their child? It was around Christmas and they were grieving that, and so to make up for it, they abducted another child. And so Melvin got to live a happy life with another family. I mean, of course, I think that's what we would all say we hope for, is that they didn't get abducted by someone who did something horrible to them, that they were with a loving family who just lied. But I really don't know about in this case. I think the bootleggers probably had a lot to do with it, and were probably really good at hiding from police, because obviously they were doing illegal things anyways. So
when Brooke and I told each other which cases we were going to be covering for our part of the collab, and she said she was going to be doing the case on Melvin Horst, I was extremely excited, because this is a case that I had researched into a little bit probably a few years back. When I was reading through Brooke's research, which she did an amazing job researching this case, it kind of jogged my memory on a few things that I thought back when I researched this case myself a few years back. The first thing is that when it comes to vintage cases, especially this old, it's very hard to form a theory on what happened, mostly because technology back then is not as advanced as it is in today's time. You never know what could have been found out about the case if it happened, say, 10, 5, 2 years ago. My main opinion, though, when it comes to this case and the disappearance of Melvin Horst, is that I just have a feeling personally that he was not abducted at random. I think that it was somebody who knew his family. I do think that it was a local to the area. I think it was somebody who maybe had it out for his family. You never know the reasons why. And that's one of the toughest things to think about when it comes to the person or people who abducted an individual, possibly being a local or somebody that the family knew, is because the family may have seen this person or people multiple times throughout the years and never knew that this person or these people were responsible for their child's disappearance and possibly murder. I think Roy's theory, where Melvin could have been passed around from bootlegger to bootlegger and them not really knowing as the years go on where he came from, and him growing up and not knowing his true identity, I think that could be very possible. The fact that no remains were ever found, you never know what could have happened. I mean, the theories are endless. Before I go though, I have to say, Brooke, Thank you so much for doing this collab with me. It was a lot of fun, and I'm excited to be able to be on each other's channels and spread around the word of these cases even more.
That's all that I have for this case. Remember that this is a collab with Gabulosis, and I will have her video linked down below. If you are new to my channel, I would really appreciate if you would see if my content is something that you enjoy, and if so, I would really appreciate you staying and becoming one of my lovely gems, because it truly means the world to me that I can share these cases with so many people who also have a passion and an empathy for what has happened to these people and hearing their stories. And so, yeah, if you want to subscribe, I would really appreciate you staying here. And don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.